Don Long, welcome to Jewish Roots. And actually, as we have done many months in the past, where we also had news from another perspective during our broadcast, over this week and perhaps next, I want to focus basically on news, Israel in the news. When we look at Jewish roots, it's very important that we understand that the roots of the Christian faith are locked up within Judaism and therefore locked up within Israel. America's support of Israel has been long-going, ongoing, from administration to administration, certainly among the people of America and among the Christians of America, a realization that, as the scriptures say, that the nations that bless Israel will be blessed, and those nations that do not bless Israel or come crosswise to her will find themselves, according to Genesis, under the curse. I want to share some things with you in this broadcast today about getting a separation between myths and facts. And actually, I can't think of a better way to do it than to read to you a statement that was made by Israeli Ambassador Prosser to the United Nations Security Council last year. I think he captures, in essence, what it is I want to communicate with you during this broadcast. He says this: Churchill once said, in the time that it takes a lie to get halfway around the world, the truth is still getting its pants on. In the barren deserts of the Middle East, myths find fertile ground to grow in, and facts remain buried in the sand. The myths forged in our region travel abroad and can find their way into the halls of the United Nations. I would like to use today's debate in the Security Council as an opportunity to address just a few of the myths that have become a permanent hindrance to our discussion of the Middle East here at the United Nations. He continues, myth number 1, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a central conflict of the Middle East. If you solve that conflict, you solve all other conflicts in the region. Make no mistake, it is important for Israel and the Palestinians to resolve our long-standing conflict for its own merits. Yet the truth is that conflicts in Syria, Yemen, Egypt, Bahrain, and many other parts of the Middle East have nothing to do with Israel. It is obvious that resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict won't stop the persecution of minorities across the region and end the subjection of women or heal sectarian divisions. Obsessing over Israel has not stopped Assad's tanks from flattening entire communities. On the contrary, it has only distracted attention from his crimes. And dedicating the majority of the debates in the United Nations to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict month after month has not stopped the Iranian regime's centrifuges from spinning. Iran's ambitions for nuclear weapons are the single greatest threat to the Middle East and the entire world. The Iranian nuclear program continues to advance at the speed of an express train. The international community's efforts to stop them are moving at the pace of the local train. Pausing at every stop for some nation to get on or off, the danger of inaction is clear. We cannot allow the diplomatic channel to provide another venue for the Iranian regime to stall for more time as they inch closer and closer to such a weapon. The ambassador continues and says, myth number 2, there is a humanitarian crisis in the Gaza Strip. In fact, numerous international organizations have said clearly that there is no humanitarian crisis in Gaza, including the deputy head of the Red Cross office in the area. Gaza's real GDP grew by more than 25% during the first 3 quarters of 2011. I would add, by the way, aside from what the ambassador says, that's faster growth in their economy than the United States. Ambassador Prosser continues, exports are expanding in Gaza. International humanitarian projects are moving forward at rapid pace. There is not a single civilian good that cannot enter Gaza today. Yet as aid flows into the area, missiles fly out. That is the crisis in Gaza. And that is what keeps Gaza from realizing its potential. It's a simple equation. If it is calm in Israel, it will be calm in Gaza, but the people of Gaza will face hardship as long as terrorists use them as human shields to rain rockets down on Israeli cities. Each rocket in Gaza is armed with a warhead capable of causing a political earthquake that would extend well beyond Israel's borders. It will only take one rocket that lands in the wrong place at the wrong time to change the equation on the ground. If that happens, Israel's leaders would be forced to respond in a completely different manner. It is time for all in the Security Council to finally wake up to the dangerous reality. The Security Council has not condemned a single rocket attack from Gaza. History's lessons are clear. Today's silence is tomorrow's tragedy. Now, let me add some personal observations to what the ambassador has said. It's amazing how a rumor gets started and years later the rumor's still going even though the facts have changed. You find that on the internet, that something comes across your email and you look at it and say, wow, I didn't know that's true. And if you're wise, you go to one of the urban legend sites to check out, is this true? And you find, oh no, that is a exposed false legend that started 8, 9, 10 years ago, and it resurfaces every 2 years, and people get up in arms over, did you know somebody said this, somebody's doing this. Lies are hard to shut down. Myths get created and are hard to overcome, even with the truth. I've had some success in showing pictures to people about Gaza, about the shopping malls in Gaza. Even the press was somewhat embarrassed to admit that these luxurious shopping malls exist in Gaza because the picture they were giving to the world was to go to the poorest neighborhoods and film people living in squalor. You know, you can do that in the United States. You can film squalor and say that's the United States, or you can say, yes, there's poverty in the United States, but there are also great malls in the United States. Same for India. You can film India in such a way that it looks like there's no advancement, no civilization, people living in primitive villages. Or you can go to the major cities of India and show some of the high-tech advancements that exist as part of their everyday life. It is unfortunately unfair at best. At worst, it's an absolute fabrication and lie for the press to continue to give any picture that Gaza is in some kind of humanitarian crisis. If there, in fact, is a humanitarian crisis at all, it is a fact that hundreds of millions of aid dollars flow into Gaza for projects that never happen because the money is turned into missiles to shoot at Israel. Just recently, a few weeks back, the Israelis discovered a massive tunnel coming from Gaza, as many tunnels are there, as the Hamas was trying to tunnel, again, as far as into an Israeli civilian community where they could then break through the ground and abduct civilians and hope to trade one Israeli for 100 or 200 or even 1,000 Palestinian prisoners. Interestingly, that entire tunnel complex was built with digging the tunnel and putting these massive concrete barriers to keep the tunnel up. So the tunnel, basically, a big concrete wall here, concrete wall here, and another concrete slab laid across the top so that they wouldn't cave in. These are massive tunnels built with that concrete. Well, it was noted by someone that there was a group of photographers that had gone in and said that the people of Gaza couldn't build their homes because they didn't have concrete for building their foundations. The Israelis were very aware that concrete is being shipped into Gaza. The question is, where is the concrete going? If the leaders of Hamas have chosen to use the concrete to build tunnels to Israel to kill people rather than to put in foundations for families to have houses, then the fault lies upon the leadership of Gaza, not upon some supposed blockade that doesn't allow civilian goods to get in. And again, all you have to do is go on the internet, go into Google and just say modern malls in Gaza, and you will be surprised at the luxury malls that exist, the amount of consumer goods that you must have a lot of money to be able to buy these things that are in Gaza. Look at Google Gaza marketplaces, and you'll see marketplaces overflowing with food. So the image that Gaza is in some kind of humanitarian crisis is old, it's ancient, it's a lie, it's not true. And yet it continues to surface on college campuses, on protesters about the humanitarian crisis. Just because somebody says it is so doesn't mean it is so. Now, let me continue with Ambassador Prosser's comments to the United Nations Security Council last year. He said, myth number 3 is settlements are the primary obstacle to peace. How many times have we heard that argument in this chamber? Just this month, the Human Rights Council proposed yet another fact-finding mission to Israel. It will explore, surprise, surprise, Israeli settlements. Today, I'd like to save the Human Rights Council and the international community some time and energy. The facts have already been found. They are plain for all to see. The fact is that from 1948 until 1967, the West Bank was part of Jordan and Gaza was part of Egypt. Now think of that. 1948 to 1967, the West Bank was part of Jordan and Gaza was part of Egypt. The Arab world did not lift a finger to create a Palestinian state, and it sought Israel's annihilation when not a single settlement stood anywhere in the West Bank or Gaza. Let me back up and reiterate that again. Having traveled to the West Bank and taking tours to Israel, we always go into the so-called settlements in Israel. You find out that the history of the West Bank and of Gaza is that when the Jordanians had the West Bank, when the Egyptians had Gaza, they still wanted to destroy Israel. So the conflict is not about settlements. The conflict was there before there were any settlements. Settlements did not spark the conflict, and removing settlements does not end the conflict. Furthermore, let me add that the fact is that when the Jordanians were in control of the West Bank, at first, by the way, they tried to annex it to Jordan, but the other Arab countries didn't want them to do that. They could have annexed, made it part of Jordan. There'd be no Palestinian state. There'd be no Palestinian issue. Some forces in the Middle East wanted there to be a Palestinian issue. But during all those years from 48 to 67, Jordan not only did not do anything to promote a Palestinian state, nor was there a Yasser Arafat running around claiming a Palestinian state. That didn't even exist for all those years when they had a prime opportunity to have their own state. But not only that, Jordan did very little to improve the infrastructure of the West Bank. They didn't build schools, they didn't build roads, they didn't extend the electric grid, they didn't bring water lines into the Palestinian communities nearly anywhere to the extent that the Israelis did after 1967. The truth is that the life of the average Palestinian in terms of their modern availability of electricity and plumbing and water and those things and schooling increased dramatically when Israel was in control of the land. Now that's so ironic. The Arabs are in control of the West Bank, and they don't help their brother Arabs out at all. The Israelis, who are supposedly the enemies, come and they take over that section to control it. And the first thing they do is they improve the quality of life and the quality of education. Someone isn't understanding the facts. Let me continue with Ambassador Prosser for a moment here. He said the fact is that in 2005, we took every settlement out of Gaza and only got rockets on our cities in return. The fact is that this Israeli government put in place an unprecedented 10-month moratorium on settlements. The Palestinian leadership used the gesture as an opportunity to take Israel and the international community on another ride to nowhere. For 9 of those months, they rejected the moratorium as insufficient and then demanded that Israel extend it at the end of that time. As a former U.S. Special Envoy George Mitchell said, what had been less than worthless a few months earlier became indispensable to the continued negotiations for the Palestinians. Now, again, let me make an aside comment here. My wife, my daughter, and I were in Gaza in 2005 when Prime Minister Sharon said, by the way, under pressure of the United States, you got to do something, you got to do something, you got to do something, unilaterally withdrew the settlements from Gaza. He had every right to be there. Biblically, the land of Gaza belongs under the kingdom of Israel. And he didn't get anything in exchange, no agreement with the Palestinians to work things out. He said, fine, settlements are an issue. We'll take all the settlements out of Gaza. And they forcibly removed all the Jews out of Gaza. Donna and I were in the homes of some of the residents of Gaza at that time that are absolutely beside themselves. They're not harming anybody. They're not hurting anybody. You know, the Israelis could have simply said, we'll give you control of Gaza. But by the way, you know, the Israeli people who live in Gaza should have a right to live there. Why is it that the Palestinians could not own Gaza, and yet the Jewish families could still live there running their farms and everything? Why is it that our nation, the United States, agreed to a policy that Gaza would be, in the German term, Judenrein, free of Jews? Can you imagine we have a dispute with the Indians over a place, and we finally say, okay, you know, you're right, that territory belongs to the Indians, all the white people have to leave. Why? If they have a house, can they stay there? Yeah, maybe they were paying their taxes to the state of Arizona, now they pay them to the Indian reservation. Why would we say they have to leave? That's unprecedented in history. And so he pulled out all the Jews for one reason, by the way. If they pulled the military out and left the Jews there, they knew the Palestinians would kill them. That's the plain fact. That's, by the way, the same truth for what Palestinians want now when they say a two-state solution. They want a state of their own, but no Jew will be allowed to live there. Now, I can remember talking with some of my Israeli friends and saying, well, fine. So give them part of the West Bank and say, you're right, we will agree no Jews will ever live in the West Bank. But by the way, no Arab will live in Israel. And they all laughed and said, that would be fair, but can you imagine the international outcry? Think of it a moment. Why is it wrong for Israel to say no Arab can live in Israel, but it's okay for the Palestinians to create a state that says no Jew can live here? See, it's not even equal for equal. It's an insanity that doesn't know how to stand up to evil and address it. So I watched as the Israelis were literally forced and dragged out of their homes, all for peace. But instead of peace, they've got hundreds of rockets being fired every year into Israel. That is, one place firing rockets into another sovereign nation. I can't imagine any nation in the world, none, not one nation in the world, would put up with their neighbor firing rockets into their land without going to war to stop that. If Israel goes back into Gaza again, which I believe they're going to have to, the world says, oh, terrible, terrible, terrible. Excuse me. Your neighbor's shooting rockets into your land and you get criticized for trying to stop it? Can you see the insanity that goes in what's going on in the world? So Gaza was given for peace and instead they got war. How many times does that have to happen before you recognize you can't negotiate with terrorists, and you cannot give evil people things thinking that they're going to respond with kindness? If they're evil to begin with, then they're just going to take your giving as a sign of weakness, and that has a lot to do with a subject that I will be addressing next week in this broadcast about the Geneva agreement that was made over Iran. It is insanity to think that you can just give away and give away and give away to people who say what we want is your destruction, and you give it when they have no agreement. It's like our government pressuring Israel to give up prisoners. Well, maybe as a gesture to restart negotiations, how about if we You give 500 prisoners, terrorists who have blood on their hands, release them as a sign of your goodwill. That isn't a sign of goodwill to the Palestinians. They see it as a sign of weakness on the part of the West. I find that any child in elementary school can understand that. When you put it in front of them, they'll say, well, why would they do that? Why would you release the bad people when you get nothing in exchange? It's a world insane that doesn't know how to distinguish between good and evil and how you deal with it. Now, let's get back to Ambassador Prosser as I bring this broadcast to a close today. He says this: the primary obstacle to peace is not settlements. The primary obstacle to peace is a so-called claim of return and the Palestinians' refusal to recognize Israel's right to exist at all as a nation state of the Jewish people. You will never hear Palestinian leaders say 2 states for 2 peoples. You won't hear them say 2 states for 2 peoples because today the Palestinian leadership is calling for an independent Palestinian state, but insists that its people return to the Jewish state and override it simply by their population. Some of you might say, he continues, oh, Ambassador, but the Palestinians know they'll have to give up this claim. That's what they whisper quietly at the negotiating table. Ladies and gentlemen, the Palestinian leadership has never said publicly that they will give up the so-called claim of return, neither to the Palestinian people, to the Arab world, to the international community, or to anyone else. Since the Palestinian leadership refuses to tell the Palestinian people the truth, the international community has a responsibility to tell them the truth. You have a duty to stand up and say that the so-called claim of return is a non-starter. Instead of telling the Palestinian people the truth, much of the international community stands idle as the Arab world tries to erase the Jewish people's historic connection to the land of Israel. Across the Arab world and even at this table, you hear claims that Israel is Judaizing Jerusalem. These accusations come about 3,000 years too late. It's like accusing the NBA of Americanizing basketball. Like many nations around the table, the Jewish people have a proud legacy of age-old kings and queens. It's just that our tradition goes back a few years earlier. Since King David laid the cornerstone for his palace in the 10th century BC, Jerusalem has served as the heart of our faith. I might add as an aside that Jerusalem never was a capital of any Arab nation ever. It never was a capital. And Jerusalem, even as a holy place to Islam, is third on the list. Mecca is the city. And the Muslims, when they're in Jerusalem, when they bow to pray, they don't pray toward Temple Mount. They pray with their back to Temple Mount because they face Mecca. It is a myth to say that Jerusalem is a holy city to the Muslims at the same rate that it is a holy city to the Jews. It is the holy city for the Jews. It is not the holy city for the Muslims. I might add further that Jerusalem is mentioned over 700 times in the Bible. But you can read the Quran from cover to cover, and you will discover that Jerusalem is not mentioned one time in the Quran. And so to say, well, we're going to split Jerusalem, how are you splitting someone else's capital? The holiest sites in Jerusalem, the eternal capital of the Jewish people, were closed only to Jews from 1948 to 1967. Think about it. When the Jordanians controlled half that city, no Jew was allowed to get to their holy sites. Why would you think it would be any different today? Oh, they'll give guarantees. No, they gave guarantees back then. But the truth was no Jew was allowed to go to the Holy Temple Mount. Once Israel controlled all of Jerusalem, every religious group, Christian, Jew, or Muslim, has a right to visit their holy sites. Since Israel unified the city, the ambassador continues, it has thrived under the values of tolerance and freedom. For the first time in centuries, sacred places that were once sealed off along religious lines are now permanently open for worship by all peoples. There is another great truth that this organization, the ambassador concludes, has completely overlooked for the past 64 years. In all of the pages that the United Nations has written about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, in all of the reports and fact-finding commissions, and in all of the hours dedicated to debate about the Middle East, there's one great untold story. Or, to be more specific, there are more than 850,000 untold stories. More than 850,000 Jews have been uprooted from their homes in Arab countries during the last 64 years. These were vibrant communities dating back 2,500 years. On the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, Babylonian Jewry produced many of Judaism's holiest books and thrived for 2,000 years. In the great synagogues and libraries of Cairo, Jews preserved the intellectual and scientific treasures of antiquity right through the Renaissance. Jews stood out throughout the Middle East, from Aden to Alexandria, as the greatest artists, musicians, businessmen, and writers. And all of these communities were wiped out. Age-old family businesses and properties were confiscated. Jewish quarters were destroyed. Pogroms left synagogues looted, graveyards desecrated, and thousands dead. The pages that the UN has written about the Palestinian refugees could fill up soccer stadiums, but not a drop of ink has been spilled about the Jewish refugees. Out of over 1,088 UN resolutions on the Middle East, you will not find a single syllable regarding the displacement of Jewish refugees. There have been more than 172 resolutions exclusively devoted to the Palestinian refugees, but not one dedicated to the Jewish refugees. The discrepancy is unknown by most people. And I would say to you, the viewers of this broadcast, perhaps you need to get updated on the reality of the Middle East, which is part of what we want to do in this broadcast. I thank you for joining me today, and next week, as we continue looking at news from another perspective, we will be looking at what happened in Geneva, not just to the Middle East, but what happened to the United States. This is Pastor Don Long. You have a great week.